In 1999, two psychologists at Cornell University named David Dunning and Justin Kruger published a paper with one of the most uncomfortable titles in academic history, Unskilled and Unaware of It. The finding, in plain English, people with limited knowledge or competence in a given area greatly overestimate their knowledge or competence in that area. And the reason they can't see it is specific and structural. The metacognitive ability to recognize deficiencies in one's own knowledge or competence requires that one possess at least a minimum level of the same kind of knowledge, which those who exhibit the effect have not yet attained. In other words, you don't know what you don't know, because knowing what you don't know requires the very knowledge you lack. Now here's what most people miss when they hear about this. They hear unskilled and unaware, and they think, oh, this is about people who aren't very smart. It is not. The Dunning-Kruger effect describes the systematic tendency of people with low ability in a specific area to give overly positive assessments of their ability in that area. Specific area, not general intelligence, not overall competence, which means the most dangerous version of the Dunning-Kruger trap is not the person with low general ability who doesn't know it. It is the person with high general ability, a brilliant person, an accomplished person, a person who has succeeded at many things, who steps into a new domain and assumes that their general competence transfers automatically. This version is the one that destroys leaders. Today I'm going to walk you through three of the most documented cases of this in modern American history. A Secretary of Defense, a Silicon Valley CEO, and one more that will be closer to home than you expect. Then I'm going to show you the Stoic practice that Marcus Aurelius built specifically to protect against this trap, a daily discipline he maintained for 20 years, governing the most complex organization in the Western world. Because here's the thing, Marcus Aurelius had every reason to fall into the Dunning-Kruger trap. He was emperor of Rome. He was surrounded by people who told him he was right. He had more power than any person alive. And he is one of the very few leaders in all of recorded history who documented his deliberate, daily effort to prevent himself from believing his own confidence. Meditations is that document, and what it describes is a practice more relevant to anyone in a leadership role in 2026 than almost anything written since. Let's get into it. Part 1. The psychological diagnosis. The trap is not stupidity. It is the gap between confidence and competence, and the power that hides it. Before we get to the leaders, let me give you the actual shape of the trap, because popular culture has gotten this wrong in a way that makes it useless. The popular version of Dunning-Kruger goes like this. Incompetent people are overconfident. Competent people are appropriately humble, and the gap between them is obvious to anyone paying attention. This is not what the research says. What the research actually shows is this. Most people overestimate their performance relative to others, regardless of their actual competence level. The least skilled overestimate their scores by around 20 percentage points, while the top performers underestimate their scores by roughly 15 points. Both ends of the spectrum have a calibration problem. The direction is different, but the structural failure, the inability to accurately assess one's own knowledge relative to what is actually required, is nearly universal. Research shows that 93% of Americans think they are better drivers than average, and 90% of teachers think they are more skilled than their peers. The mathematics of those numbers make both of them impossible. And here is where it gets specifically dangerous for people in positions of power. The Dunning-Kruger trap does not hit you when you enter a domain knowing nothing. When you know nothing, you usually know you know nothing. You ask for help, you defer to experts, you move carefully. The trap hits you at the point of partial knowledge. When you know enough to feel competent, but not enough to know the boundaries of your competence. When you've had enough early success to build confidence, but that success came from skills that don't necessarily transfer to the new challenge in front of you. This is what psychologists call being on the peak of Mount Stupid, the specific point on the competence curve where confidence is highest and actual knowledge is still relatively low. During the early stages of the Dunning-Kruger effect, a person may be in the peak of Mount Stupid, where confidence is high but competence is low. As the situation develops, they may enter the valley of despair, where they start to realize the limitations of their knowledge, but by then, the decisions have already been made. The valley of despair, the moment of genuine reckoning, comes late. After the decisions, After the consequences. For an individual, this is painful. For a leader with authority over thousands of people, it is catastrophic. The Peter Principle, when competence becomes a liability. There is a second concept that pairs with Dunning-Kruger in a way that explains the leadership failure pattern specifically. It's called the Peter Principle, formulated by Lawrence Peter in 1969. The observation: in a hierarchy, people tend to rise to their level of incompetence. You are good at your job. You get promoted. You are good at the next job. You get promoted again. At some point, you get promoted into a role for which your previous success has not prepared you, because the skills that made you excellent at the previous level are not the skills required at this level. And the trap is, your track record of success gives you, and everyone around you, high confidence that you will succeed here too. The Dunning-Kruger effect and the Peter Principle are the same trap from two angles. One describes the cognitive mechanism. You can't see the boundary of your own competence. The other describes the organizational mechanism. Success in a lower domain propels you into a higher domain where your competence has not yet been tested. Together, they create the most dangerous leadership failure mode in existence. The highly successful person, promoted into new territory, who is the last one in the room to know they're out of their depth. Now let's look at what this actually looks like when it happens at the highest levels. Part 2. 3 case studies. Same trap. 3 different rooms. Thousands of consequences. Case Study 1. Robert McNamara and the Vietnam War. Robert McNamara was, by any objective measure, one of the most analytically gifted people in American public life in the 1960s. He had studied at Harvard Business School, taught there briefly as the school's youngest and highest-paid assistant professor, and then turned around Ford Motor Company as one of the original whiz kids, the group of data-driven analysts Henry Ford II hired after World War II to modernize the company. He served briefly as Ford's president before Kennedy came calling. When the Vietnam conflict began, McNamara embraced it with characteristic confidence. He insisted that victory was a matter of applying the right analytical tools and management techniques. He was a genius at measuring things. He applied that genius to war. The problem was that the things he was measuring, body counts, kill ratios, the quantitative metrics of military progress, were not the things that determined the outcome of this particular conflict. The body counts proved misleading. While U.S. forces struggled to contend with the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong, McNamara was well known for permanently sidelining officers who asked him to stop focusing on statistics and start looking at the more qualitative aspects of warfare. Officers who maintained a zealot-like focus on statistics were promoted and rewarded. This is the Dunning-Kruger trap at its most destructive. McNamara didn't lack intelligence. He lacked a specific kind of knowledge. The knowledge of what he didn't know about counterinsurgency, about Vietnamese culture, about the limits of quantitative analysis in asymmetric warfare. And because he didn't have that knowledge, he couldn't see the boundary of his competence. When McNamara arrived at the Department of Defense, he admitted that his knowledge of military matters was scant. But he was confident enough, arguably arrogant enough, to believe he could master the Pentagon with a management philosophy that involved providing aggressive leadership, questioning, suggesting alternatives, proposing objectives, and stimulating progress. His service chiefs told him in 1964 that the U.S. had not defined a militarily valid objective for Vietnam. McNamara regarded it as insignificant. With similar arrogance, he continued to believe that his strategic and tactical abilities were better than those of the military professionals, and that his micromanagement of the war was a good idea. The Valley of Despair came, but it came too late. McNamara's tragedy was not merely that he misjudged the nature of the conflict. It was that he actively worked to obscure the truth, both from the public and from himself. In his 1995 memoir, In Retrospect, McNamara finally acknowledged what the Stoics would have wanted him to acknowledge in 1963. We were wrong, terribly wrong. We owe it to future generations to explain why. He wrote, "We misjudged the geopolitical intentions of our adversaries, and we exaggerated the dangers to the United States of their actions. We viewed the people and leaders of South Vietnam in terms of our own experience." In our own experience. That phrase, that is the Dunning-Kruger trap articulated by the man who lived it. He applied a framework, brilliant in its original domain, to a situation where that framework did not apply. and the metacognitive capacity to see that limitation was precisely what his success had not given him. It was hubris, an unwillingness to accept responsibility, and political expedience that caused the Vietnam War and the reason over 58,000 American soldiers died there. One man, on the peak of Mount Stupid, with the authority to send other people into the Valley of Despair. Case Study 2. Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford during her sophomore year, at 19, to start a company she believed would revolutionize blood testing. She had studied chemical engineering, done some lab work, and filed one patent. But she had no experience running a company, no clinical trial experience, no regulatory background, and no deep expertise in the medical diagnostics domain she was about to disrupt. The vision was genuine. The ambition was extraordinary. The confidence was, by every account, absolute. Here is the critical detail that the Dunning-Kruger framework illuminates. Holmes was not unintelligent. She was, by most accounts, highly intelligent. But she was operating in a domain, medical diagnostics, laboratory science, regulatory compliance, where her intelligence alone was insufficient and where she lacked the metacognitive capacity to recognize that insufficiency. Her overconfidence and inability to recognize her own limitations led her to make poor decisions, resulting in the catastrophic collapse of her company. The Dunning-Kruger dimension of the Holmes story is specific and worth naming. The early fundraising success, the board members, the investors, the magazine covers. Each of these functioned as confirmation of competence that she had not actually demonstrated in the domain that mattered. Silicon Valley success patterns, raise money, move fast, iterate, were applied to a domain, medical diagnostics, where different patterns apply, where patient safety is not a pivot, where regulatory approval is not optional, where the data has to actually work. When Elizabeth Holmes sat before SEC attorneys in the summer of 2017, a year before the company finally collapsed, she said, "I don't know more than 600 times. 600 times. That is the Valley of Despair on the record. But the Valley of Despair came after the decisions, after the patience, after the harm. The Dunning-Kruger trap doesn't announce itself when you enter it. It announces itself when you've already driven off the cliff." Case Study 3. The one closest to home. The third case study doesn't have a famous name attached to it. It is you, or someone you know, or someone you work for. Because the Dunning-Kruger trap doesn't only happen at the Secretary of Defense level or the Silicon Valley unicorn level. It happens at every level where a person's prior success gives them authority in a new domain. The manager who was excellent as an individual contributor, analytical, precise, high-performing, who gets promoted into leading a team and assumes that the skills that made them successful in the individual role will transfer automatically to the management role. They don't. Managing people requires a different kind of knowledge than performing work. The metacognitive gap between "I am excellent at this task" and "I understand how to develop other people at this task" is enormous. And success in the first gives you no guarantee of competence in the second. The expert in one field who starts opining confidently in adjacent fields. The engineer who becomes certain about economic policy. The doctor who becomes certain about education policy. Because their expertise in one domain generates a general confidence that doesn't honor the boundaries of what they actually know. The entrepreneur who succeeds in one industry and raises money for a second, carrying the confidence of the first success into a domain where the dynamics are completely different, and where their track record has bought them credibility they have not yet earned in the new space. The Dunning-Kruger effect has been demonstrated across multiple studies in a wide range of tasks from fields such as business, politics, medicine, driving, aviation, spatial memory, and more. It is not a rare pathology. It is the default. And the reason it's the default is structural, not moral. You cannot know the shape of what you don't know. That's not a character flaw. It is the literal definition of the knowledge gap. The question is not, how do I avoid this entirely? The question is, how do I build a practice that catches it? And that's the question Marcus Aurelius was answering, for himself, every single day, for 20 years. Part 3. The Stoic Diagnosis. The emperor who was most afraid of believing his own confidence. Here is the thing about Marcus Aurelius that most people miss when they first encounter the Meditations. He was emperor of Rome. He commanded the most powerful military force in the Western world. He had more concentrated authority than almost any human being who has ever lived. And he spent 20 years writing notes to himself about how he might be wrong. Not because he was weak, because he understood, more clearly than almost any leader in history, that power is the most effective incubator for the Dunning-Kruger trap that exists. When you have power, people tell you you're right. When you have success, your track record confirms your confidence. When you have authority, your decisions are implemented without the friction that would reveal their flaws. Power removes the feedback mechanisms that would otherwise correct your blind spots. Marcus understood this, and he built a specific daily practice, the practice that produced the meditations, specifically to replace the feedback that power removes. He wrote in Book 6, "If someone is able to show me that what I think or do is not right, I will happily change, for I seek the truth, by which no one was ever truly harmed. It is the person who continues in his self-deception and ignorance who is harmed." Read the last sentence again. It is the person who continues in self-deception and ignorance who is harmed. He was not describing someone else. He was describing the danger he was most afraid of in himself. The Stoic term for the cognitive discipline Marcus practiced is epimelia hutu, care of the self. Specifically, care of the rational, examining faculty that allows you to see your own thinking clearly, rather than through the flattering lens of your own confidence. And the Stoic name for the failure to practice it, the failure that McNamara and Holmes and every leader at the top of their false certainty demonstrates, is phronesis absent, wisdom missing. Not malice, missing wisdom. The distinction matters enormously for what the practice looks like. The Stoic epistemological humility, what it actually is. Epictetus, the freed slave who had every reason to be bitter and chose instead to build the most rigorous philosophy of self-examination in the ancient world, wrote, "It is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows." 7 words. The entire Dunning-Kruger problem, stated perfectly 1,900 years before Dunning and Kruger. The Stoic practice is not about making yourself doubt everything. It is not about false modesty or the kind of performed uncertainty that is its own form of ego. It is about a specific discipline, actively maintaining the distinction between what you know through examination and what you believe through confidence. Episteme versus doxa, as we discussed in the post-truth episode. Real knowledge versus the feeling of knowledge. The McNamara problem was not that he lacked intelligence. It was that he had substituted confidence for examination, and the substitution felt exactly like certainty. The Holmes problem was not ambition. It was that she could no longer distinguish between her vision of what the technology could do and her examination of what it was currently doing. The daily practice Marcus maintained was the practice of deliberately reinstating that distinction, every morning, every evening, so that confidence could never fully replace examination. And that practice has 4 specific components that we can use today. Part 4, the Stoic Toolkit. The 4-practice anti-Dunning-Kruger protocol from Marcus Aurelius's daily discipline. Practice 1, the beginner's audit. In what domains am I operating on confidence rather than examination? Marcus Aurelius begins Meditations, Book 1, not with his own insights, but with a list of everyone he learned from. His grandfather, his father, his teachers, the specific thing each of them taught him. From Rusticus, to read attentively and not be satisfied with a superficial understanding. An emperor, listing his debts to teachers. This is not performative humility. This is the opening move of a man who understood that keeping the catalog of where your knowledge came from prevents you from confusing received wisdom with your own examination. The beginner's audit is a practice you can do right now and repeat monthly. Pick 3 domains where you currently have authority, where people defer to your judgment, where your confidence is high. For each one, ask, Question 1. When did I last actively learn something that challenged my existing view in this domain? Not information that confirmed what I already believed. Information that required me to update. If the answer is, I can't remember, that is the Dunning-Kruger signal. High confidence, low recent input, no updating. That's the peak of Mount Stupid. Question 2. Who in this domain knows more than I do? And am I actually talking to them? McNamara sidelined the officers who challenged his framework. He promoted the ones who confirmed it. The beginner's audit asks you to reverse that. Actively seek the person whose knowledge exceeds yours in the areas where you feel most certain. Question 3. What would I need to see to change my mind on my most confident belief in this domain? If you cannot answer this question, if there is no conceivable evidence that would shift your position, that is not conviction. That is the Dunning-Kruger trap, locked. Genuine knowledge has a shape. It knows what would falsify it. Overconfidence doesn't, because it isn't operating from examination, it's operating from certainty that no longer needs testing. Practice 2. The Council of Critics. Whose job is it to tell me when I'm wrong? And do they actually do it? Marcus Aurelius inherited a practice from his Stoic teachers that he returned to repeatedly in the Meditations. The deliberate cultivation of advisors who would tell him the truth. Not flatterers, not yes men, people whose specific role was to challenge. He writes in Book 2, "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly." Most people read this as a grim warning about human nature. It is actually a practical preparation for receiving hard feedback without being destabilized by the delivery. Marcus was preloading his tolerance for criticism so that when the criticism came, and it always came, he could hear the content rather than reacting to the discomfort. The Council of Critics practice has 2 components. Component 1, build the council. Actively identify 2 or 3 people in your professional life whose specific role is to disagree with you. Not on everything, on the things you are most confident about. These should be people who know the domain, who have no incentive to flatter you, and who have demonstrated the willingness to say uncomfortable things. If you cannot name 2 or 3 such people, if everyone around you tends to agree with you, that is not evidence that you are right. It is evidence that power has removed the feedback mechanism. Rebuild it deliberately. Component 2, create the conditions. The most common failure of the Council of Critics is not the absence of critics. It's the absence of conditions that allow them to speak. McNamara had advisors who knew the Vietnam strategy was failing. He sidelined them. He created conditions where disagreement was punished, not through explicit threat, but through the organizational signals that told people which information was welcome. The question is not, do I have people who could tell me I'm wrong? The question is, have I created conditions where they actually will? Ask directly, what is the strongest argument against my current position? And mean it. Practice 3, the competence mapping. Where does my knowledge actually end? And have I been honest about that boundary? Epictetus taught his students to begin every inquiry with a distinction. What is in my control and what is not in my control? The leadership version of this, the one that prevents the Dunning-Kruger trap, is a parallel distinction. What is within my competence and what is outside my competence? Not what I feel confident about, what I have actually examined and can justify with traceable reasoning. The competence mapping practice is this. Draw, literally, on paper, 3 concentric circles. Inner circle, the domain of genuine expertise, where you have done the work, received the feedback, updated your understanding, and can explain your reasoning in detail to someone who challenges it. This is your episteme zone. Middle circle, the domain of informed opinion, where you have enough knowledge to have a useful view, but not enough to be an authority. This is the zone where you should be actively learning and actively seeking challenge. Outer circle, the domain of confident ignorance, where you have opinions, often strong ones, but those opinions are based primarily on your general intelligence, your identity, and your prior success rather than on domain-specific examination. This is the Dunning-Kruger zone. The exercise is to honestly populate all 3 circles. And then, this is the critical part, to notice whether your level of expressed confidence in public matches the circle the topic actually belongs in. McNamara was genuinely in the inner circle on data-driven management. He was in the middle circle on military strategy. He was in the outer circle on counterinsurgency in Southeast Asia. He expressed the same level of confidence in all 3. The competence map is the practice of maintaining that distinction, so that your expressed confidence tracks your actual knowledge rather than your general authority. Practice 4, the evening examination. What did I get wrong today, and what did I do about it? This is the oldest and most central of the Stoic practices for epistemic humility. Seneca describes it in De Ira, on Anger, Book 3. When the light has been removed and my wife has fallen silent, aware of the habit that's now mine, I examine my entire day and go back over what I've done and said, hiding nothing from myself, passing nothing by. He did this every night, not as self-punishment, as calibration. The questions he asked himself were specific. What did I do that I should not have done? What did I fail to do that I should have done? What did I say with more confidence than my knowledge justified? That last question is the Dunning-Kruger specific. Marcus Aurelius maintained a similar practice. The meditations are largely the output of it. Every evening, he was reviewing his decisions, his judgments, his expressions of certainty, and asking whether they were justified. Not, was I right? But, was my confidence proportionate to my actual knowledge? This distinction is the entire practice. Because Dunning-Kruger doesn't kill you with the wrong decision. It kills you with the wrong confidence. The certainty that closes the feedback loop before the decision has been tested. The evening examination reopens that loop every day before the consequences of today's overconfidence have compounded into tomorrow's catastrophe. The modern form of this practice is simple. Each evening, before sleep, write 3 sentences. 1. The most confident claim I made today was. 2. The evidence I had for that claim was. 3. If I'm wrong about this, I would expect to see as evidence. 3 sentences, 90 seconds, every night. That practice, maintained over months, will do more for the quality of your decision-making than any book or course or framework, because it builds the metacognitive habit of distinguishing confidence from knowledge at the moment when the distinction matters most, before the consequences arrive. Putting it together, the Epistemic Humility Protocol. For practices, 1 system. Practice 1, the beginner's audit, monthly in your domains of authority. When? Did you last update? Who knows more than you? And are you talking to them? What would change your most confident belief? Practice 2, the Council of Critics, ongoing. Name 2 or 3 people whose specific role is to challenge your most confident positions. Create conditions where they actually will. Practice 3, the Competence Map, quarterly 3 circles. Inner, genuine expertise. Middle, informed opinion. Outer, confident ignorance. Does your expressed confidence track the circle or your general authority? Practice 4, the evening examination, daily 3 sentences. Most confident claim. Evidence behind it. What would falsify it? Together, these 4 practices do what Marcus Aurelius's daily discipline did for him. They replace the feedback that power, success, and authority remove. They make you the person in the room who is most likely to catch the Dunning-Kruger trap before it becomes the decision that defines everything that follows. The practice this week. This week, 1 thing only. Start the evening examination. Tonight, before you sleep, write 3 sentences in a notebook, your phone, wherever you capture things. The most confident claim I made today was. The evidence I had for that claim was. If I'm wrong about this, I would expect to see as evidence. Do this for 7 nights. At the end of 7 nights, read what you've written. You will find one of 2 things. Either your confidence is genuinely tracking your knowledge, in which case the practice has given you 7 days of documented clarity about the quality of your own thinking. Or you will find a pattern of confident claims made without adequate evidence, claims that sound authoritative when you say them, but reveal their fragility when you have to write down what would falsify them. Either outcome is valuable. The first is reassurance. The second is the early warning system that McNamara never had. I want to end with something about McNamara that is rarely discussed. After Vietnam, after the memoir, after the documentary where he finally said the words out loud, "We were wrong, terribly wrong," McNamara spent the last decades of his life doing something unusual for a man who had caused so much damage through overconfidence. He went back to school, not literally, but he spent his remaining years in a sustained, deliberate effort to understand what he had not understood when it mattered. He talked to Vietnamese generals. He studied the conflict from their perspective. He updated. The Valley of Despair, when he finally fully entered it, produced something real, a man who had learned what he hadn't known, 30 years too late. The Stoic practice is not designed to spare you the valley of despair entirely. It is designed to move it earlier, to compress the timeline between the moment of false certainty and the moment of honest reckoning. Because the shorter that gap, the fewer the consequences that accumulate while you're still certain you're right. Marcus Aurelius wrote, in a section of the Meditations that reads more like a prayer than a philosophical treatise, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." The same applies here. Waste no more time arguing what a leader who avoids the Dunning-Kruger trap should look like. Be the one who runs the evening examination tonight. Be the one who populates the competence map honestly. Be the one who builds the council of critics before the crisis makes them necessary. The trap is structural. The practice is a choice. Marcus had 20 years to practice on the most powerful throne in the Western world. You have today. I'll see you in the next one.